On the day of my mother's wedding, my aunt whispered loudly, "Trash will always be trash." So my mother ignored me all night. Minutes later, my best friend's dad offered me a ride home, saying, "You don't deserve to stand here in the rain." The rain had just started, light at first, almost misting the air like a broken sprinkler. I was standing near the edge of the reception tent, my arms crossed tight against the chill creeping under my thin dress. People were laughing, clinking glasses, and pretending everything was perfect. Mr. Carson approached quietly, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his suit jacket. He stood next to me for a moment without saying anything, like he was giving me time to breathe. "You don't deserve to be standing here in the rain," he said finally, voice low and certain. I looked at him, blinking back the sudden hot sting behind my eyes. "Come on," he added, with a small nod toward his truck parked across the lawn. "Let's get you out of here." I hesitated for a second, just a second, and then followed him. The whole day had been a slow-motion car crash, and somehow, I had known it would be. Sharon, my mother, had been planning this wedding to Earl for months, obsessing over every tiny detail as if a perfect ceremony would erase all the failures she didn't talk about. The invitations were gold embossed, the chairs had lace covers, and the cake was a 6-tiered monstrosity that leaned slightly to the left. I was an afterthought. She had given me strict instructions days before the wedding: don't draw attention. Don't embarrass me. Don't act like a victim. She had picked apart the dress I chose, a sky blue thing from the Goodwill down on Montgomery Street, telling me it looked cheap and desperate. When I offered to help with last-minute tasks, she waved me off like a bothersome fly. "Go sit down or something," she said. "You're making me anxious just standing there." So I had spent most of the afternoon weaving between groups of people I barely knew, sipping lukewarm lemonade and keeping my head down. Then, during the ceremony, it happened. Aunt Marjorie, Sharon's older sister, leaned in toward a woman I didn't recognize, a neighbor maybe, or a coworker, and said, too loudly to be mistaken for a whisper, "Trash will always be trash." The words struck like a slap across the face. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe she hadn't meant me. But the quick sideways glances from the people sitting nearby told me otherwise. Sharon's eyes flicked over me once, briefly, blankly, and then slid right past as if she hadn't seen or heard a thing. Not a single person said a word to defend me. Not during the ceremony. Not during the reception. Not after I slipped away toward the edge of the tent, staring out at the growing sheets of rain. I wasn't even angry. I was just tired. Tired in a way that settled deep into my bones. As the rain picked up, guests began gathering their things, scuttling for cover like ants fleeing a flooded hill. Sharon and Earl stayed near the dance floor, laughing and slow dancing under the tent lights. If Sharon noticed that I was soaked to the skin, she didn't show it. That's when Mr. Carson found me. He didn't hover or push. He simply stood nearby, giving me a way out without forcing my hand. When he offered the ride, there wasn't a single part of me that thought it was wrong to accept. It felt like survival. The ride back to his house was quiet, just the hum of the truck engine and the steady whoosh of the windshield wipers. My hands were balled in my lap, my fingers cold and stiff. I stared out at the wet streets of Savannah, my vision blurring not from the rain but from the tears I was too proud to shed. "You're not trash, you know," Mr. Carson said after a long stretch of silence. I pressed my lips together until they hurt. "I don't care what they say. You're a good kid, and you deserve better." His voice was calm, firm, as if he was stating a fact as plain as the weather. I wanted so badly to believe him. When we pulled up outside the Carson house, the place that had always smelled like warm cookies and leather-bound books, he turned off the ignition but didn't move to get out. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. "Starting fresh?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice not to crack. "Then maybe it's time you do," he said. That night, Leah met me at the door with a towel and a tired smile. She didn't say anything about the way I was shaking, or the fact that I was still wearing my soaking thrift store dress. She just took my hand and led me to the couch. We stayed up late, watching old TV shows with the volume low, the glow of the screen flickering across the living room walls. At some point, without meaning to, I fell asleep curled against the cushions, the towel still draped around my shoulders. When I woke up the next morning, it was raining again, but the world felt lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, I was allowed to exist outside of Sharon's shadow. The next few days were a blur of quiet arrangements. Mr. Carson made a few calls, pulling every favor he could find. Leah helped me put together a resume. I got a part-time job shelving books at a cozy little bookstore tucked between an old bakery and a barbershop downtown. The owner, Mrs. Tisdale, was an elderly woman with silver hair and a mischievous glint in her eye. She hired me on the spot after asking only 2 questions: "Can you alphabetize?" and "Can you tolerate the smell of old paper?" I said yes to both. For the first time in my life, I had something that was mine. No Sharon. No Aunt Marjorie. No whispered insults trailing after me like smoke. Just me, and the slow, painstaking process of building something different. Of building myself. I didn't tell Sharon where I was. At first, I thought she might come looking for me, might call the Carsons, might show up at the bookstore, might at least send a text filled with manufactured outrage. Something. Anything. But days turned into a week, and a week into 2, and the silence stretched longer and longer until it became its own kind of answer. Sharon wasn't coming. She was too busy playing house with Earl, throwing dinner parties for people she barely knew, posing for pictures she could post online with captions like #blessed and #newbeginnings. Pretending, as she always had, that her life was perfectly curated and glossy, no room for the parts she didn't like. No room for me. I should have expected it. Part of me had expected it. But it still carved a hollow ache in my chest that even the slow, soothing hours at the bookstore couldn't completely erase. Mrs. Tisdale noticed before anyone else. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, when the shop was empty except for a couple of college kids studying by the window, she sidled up to me while I was rearranging a display of gardening books. "You look like a houseplant someone forgot to water," she said dryly, not unkindly. I laughed, a short, broken sound. "Why don't you take the rest of the day, hon?" she said, her voice softening. "Go do something that makes you feel alive." I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what feeling alive was supposed to feel like. But I clocked out early, shoved my umbrella against the downpour, and wandered through the downtown streets of Savannah without any destination in mind. I ended up in Forsyth Park, naturally. The same park where Sharon had married Earl under fairy lights and rented canopies just a few weeks earlier. Now, the place was empty. The rain blurred the outlines of the oak trees and turned the stone pathways slick and shiny. The benches sat deserted. The fountains burbled to no one. I found the exact spot where I had stood that day, just beyond the tent's edge, half hidden, soaking wet, invisible. The memory hit harder than I expected. I had to sit down suddenly, my knees giving out under the weight of it. I thought about Aunt Marjorie's words, still ringing in my ears like an old wound you can't stop picking at. Trash will always be trash. It was funny, in a sick kind of way. They'd spent so long convincing me I was worthless that it had started to feel like the truth. But if it was true, if I was really trash, why had Mr. Carson offered me a ride without judgment? Why had Leah opened her home to me without question? Why had Mrs. Tisdale hired me without suspicion? Why did these people who didn't have to care, treat me like I was worth something? I stayed there in the rain for a long time, thinking. Letting the cold seep into my bones. Letting the sadness bleed out of me, slow and steady. By the time I finally stood up again, my dress was plastered to my skin and my shoes squelched with every step. But somehow, my heart felt lighter. I wasn't going back. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of affection anymore. If Sharon wanted to pretend I didn't exist, fine. I would build a life so beautiful and whole that her absence would be a footnote, not a chapter. Back at the Carson house, things settled into a quiet rhythm. Leah and I cooked cheap pasta dinners together, usually burning something in the process and laughing about it until our sides hurt. Mr. Carson kept fixing little things around the house, the leaky faucet, the broken step on the porch, grumbling loudly the whole time but with a softness around the edges that said he didn't mind. It wasn't perfect. We didn't pretend it was. Some nights I still cried quietly into my pillow, mourning something I couldn't name. Some mornings I woke up gripped with fear that it would all vanish, that I would be shoved back into Sharon's world without warning. But for the first time, I had hope alongside the fear. A tiny, stubborn flame refusing to be snuffed out. School started up again. I juggled classes and bookstore shifts, collapsing into bed at night with aching feet and a brain crammed full of facts and formulas. It was exhausting, overwhelming, exhilarating. Mr. Carson taught me how to check my car's oil and change a tire. Leah taught me how to negotiate better tips at the coffee shop where she worked weekends. Mrs. Tisdale taught me how to brew the perfect cup of tea. Little lessons. Little victories. Piece by piece, I was becoming someone. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sharon finally called again. I was shelving a batch of new arrivals, travel guides, mostly, when my phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I almost didn't answer. Part of me didn't want to hear whatever she had to say. But some stubborn, wounded part of me picked up anyway. Hello? There was a pause, the faint rustle of static, and then her voice, brittle and bright. Well, I hope you're happy, she said without preamble. I blinked. What? I had to tell everyone you were studying abroad. In France, no less. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is, having people ask about you at church and not having an answer? I swallowed hard, the old familiar sting rising up. I'm not your PR problem, Sharon, I said quietly. There was another pause, longer this time. Then a cold laugh. You think you're better than me now, she sneered. Because you have a minimum wage job and a couch to crash on? No, I said, surprised at how steady my voice was. I think I'm free. I ended the call before she could say anything else. My hands were trembling when I put the phone back into my pocket. But for the first time in my life, the tremble wasn't from fear. It was adrenaline. Power. Mrs. Tisdale glanced over from behind the register, arching one silver eyebrow. You okay, sugar? I nodded, forcing a small smile. Yeah. Actually, yeah. The days that followed passed quietly. I kept waiting for Sharon to show up in person, to storm into the bookstore or the Carson house, demanding I come back, or at least create some scene to save face. But she didn't. Instead, the silence thickened, stretching out like an unanswered question. Still, the pit in my stomach didn't go away. It grew roots instead, a low buzz of anxiety under my skin that made me double-check locked doors and glance over my shoulder without thinking. Leah noticed. One night, while we sat on the back porch sharing a bag of stale marshmallows we'd found in the pantry, she nudged me with her foot. You know you don't have to wait for her to ruin things, right? She said. I shrugged, picking at the frayed hem of my jeans. It's just, she's always found a way. No matter how far I try to get. Leah was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. Maybe it's time to stop running, she said finally. Maybe it's time you stand still. Let her be the one who falls over herself for once. Her words sat heavy in my chest, too big to swallow. I didn't know how to stand still. I didn't know how to not brace for the next impact. But I wanted to try. I owed myself that much. It wasn't Sharon who came next. It was Aunt Marjorie. She showed up at the bookstore on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when Savannah's humidity made the air feel like a wet sweater clinging to your skin. I was restocking a shelf of cookbooks when the door chimed. I didn't look up at first. But then I caught a whiff of her perfume, something sharp and sweet, like crushed gardenias left too long in a vase, and my stomach twisted. Well, she said, her voice carrying far too easily in the small, quiet shop. Look at you. Playing store clerk. I turned slowly, the book still in my hand. Marjorie looked exactly the same. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair. Pearl earrings. A jacket so stiff and pressed it probably could have stood on its own. Her smile was tight, like it hurt to hold. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Her smile widened, all teeth. "I came to offer you a chance," she said smoothly. "Come back. Make amends. You don't want to be the kind of girl who wastes her whole life proving a point, do you?" I stared at her, feeling something hard and immovable settle inside me. "What kind of amends are you talking about?" Marjorie shrugged, as if it were obvious. "A nice apology. An acknowledgement that you were misguided. That you were wrong to cause a scene." A scene. That's what she thought happened. As if my mere existence, my breathing, my standing there at the wedding, had been the offense. I set the book down carefully. "I didn't cause a scene," I said. "I showed up. I stayed quiet. I got rained on. That's it." Marjorie's expression tightened, the pleasant mask slipping for just a second. "Appearances matter," she snapped. "You embarrassed your mother." I laughed then, soft and bitter. "I think she embarrassed herself." Marjorie's eyes flashed. "You're young," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "You don't understand how the world works. You can't just cut people out because they hurt your feelings." "I'm not cutting anyone out," I said quietly. "I'm choosing not to keep bleeding for people who don't even notice I'm hurt." Mrs. Tisdale appeared behind the counter just then, moving silently like a cat, her gaze cool and sharp. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, voice deceptively mild. Marjorie straightened, smoothing the front of her jacket. "No problem," she said crisply. "Just a family discussion." "Good," Mrs. Tisdale said, still watching her. "Because we don't allow pester in this shop. Even family pester." Marjorie's mouth opened, then snapped shut again. She cast one last, scathing glance at me before turning on her heel and marching out the door, the bell jangling violently behind her. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Mrs. Tisdale gave me a look that was half sympathy, half steel. "Don't let ghosts boss you around, sugar," she said. I nodded, swallowing hard. Ghosts. That's what they were. Sharon. Marjorie. All of them. Ghosts clinging to a version of me I had already buried. The next big blow came the following week. Mr. Carson sat me down at the kitchen table, Leah hovering awkwardly behind him, clearly uneasy. "You need to know something," he said gently. "Your mother's been asking around." I stiffened. "She's trying to figure out if she can force you back home," he said. "Legally." The panic hit like a cold wave. But I'm almost 18, I said. "And I'm working. And living here." "She can't just." "I know," he said, holding up a hand. "And you're doing everything right. But we need to be careful. Cross every T, dot every I." Leah squeezed my shoulder. "We're not gonna let her take you back," she said fiercely. "You're not alone." I wanted to believe them. I needed to. But the fear crawled under my skin, making it hard to breathe. I spent the next few days gathering every scrap of paper I could find, paycheck stubs, school enrollment forms, letters from Mrs. Tisdale, anything that proved I was independent, self-sufficient. Mr. Carson called a lawyer he knew from work, an old friend who agreed to look over everything for free. "We're gonna build a wall she can't climb over," he promised me one night, as we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "And if she tries?" I whispered. He smiled grimly. "Then we push back." For the first time in my life, someone wasn't telling me to just endure. Someone was willing to fight for me. And that changed everything. The next few weeks felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, bracing for a storm you couldn't see but knew was coming. I worked harder than ever at the bookstore, helped Leah study for her midterms, tried to smile when Mr. Carson cracked his terrible jokes. But underneath it all was a constant hum of tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Then, just when things started to feel almost normal again, Sharon made her move. It came in the form of a formal letter, delivered to the Carson house by registered mail. Mr. Carson opened it at the kitchen table, reading it once, then again, his jaw tightening. "She's petitioning for custody," he said, voice flat. "Claiming you're a runaway. That you're being harbored." My stomach dropped. But I'm working. I'm enrolled in school. I've been living here, I know," he said quickly. "And you're almost 18. It's just a scare tactic." Leah grabbed the letter and read it over his shoulder. "She's trying to drag you back to her house," she said incredulously. "To use you like some trophy." Mr. Carson looked at me, his gaze steady. "We can fight this," he said. "But it'll mean dragging her through the mud if we have to." For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me still clung to the old fear, the old instinct to keep my head down, not make waves. But then I remembered the way Sharon had looked right through me at her wedding. The way Aunt Marjorie had said trash will always be trash, like a promise. I remembered standing alone in the rain, shivering, waiting for someone to care. "No more. Let's fight," I said. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The lawyer Mr. Carson had found, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Doyle, was relentless. She gathered every document, every witness, every scrap of evidence. Pay stubs showing I was employed. School records proving I was enrolled and passing my classes. Witness statements from Mrs. Tisdale and even some of the Carsons' neighbors who had seen me living there peacefully. We filed an official emancipation request to make it airtight. Sharon and Marjorie, meanwhile, tried to play the Southern Belle card in court, all pearl-clutching and crocodile tears. Sharon painted herself as a concerned, heartbroken mother desperate to rescue her poor misguided daughter from the clutches of a manipulative family. I sat in the courtroom, wearing my best, borrowed, dress, listening to her lie through her teeth. And then, it was my turn. Miss Doyle stood beside me, calm and professional, and asked me the questions we had practiced. I told the truth. Simple, plain, unvarnished. About the years of neglect. About the emotional manipulation. About standing alone at my mother's wedding while she pretended I wasn't even there. About the whisper, "Trash will always be trash," that still echoed in my ears. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just told the truth. The judge listened carefully, his face giving nothing away. When it was all over, we waited for what felt like hours in the small, cold courtroom. Finally, the judge looked over his glasses at Sharon. "Ma'am, from what I've seen, your concern seems less about your daughter's well-being and more about your social standing," he said bluntly. Sharon blanched, her mouth falling open. He turned to me. "Miss," he said, voice firm but kind, "you have demonstrated that you are capable, responsible, and making positive steps toward your future. I am granting your emancipation." It was done. It was over. Sharon made a strangled sound, half protest, half outrage, but the judge had already moved on. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I had shed 100 pounds of dead weight. I was free. The revenge didn't end there, though. Because the thing about small towns like Savannah? People talk. It didn't take long for the real story to trickle out, about Sharon trying to drag her own daughter back for appearances. About Aunt Marjorie's nasty little comments. About the court case and Sharon's very public loss. Her precious image, the one she had curated so carefully, cracked wide open. Her friends at church, her social circles, even her beloved Facebook audience, they turned. Slowly at first. Then faster. The invitations stopped coming. The polite smiles turned into whispers behind her back. Her new husband Earl started spending more and more time away on business trips. The final blow came a few months later when Sharon's carefully crafted life fell apart entirely, not because of anything I did directly, but because when your whole life is built on lies and appearances, it doesn't take much to topple it. Meanwhile, I thrived. I finished high school. Got a full scholarship to a small liberal arts college in Macon. Got promoted at the bookstore, assistant manager. Mr. Carson threw me a graduation party in their backyard, fairy lights strung between the trees, homemade banners, a lopsided cake Leah baked herself. At one point that night, as the sun was setting and the fireflies blinked lazily over the lawn, Mr. Carson handed me a small, wrapped box. Inside was a key, a real one, on a worn leather keychain. "It's not much," he said, smiling a little. "But it's yours. Your own place. No strings." I burst into tears, the kind that washed away old wounds. I had made it. Not because I crushed Sharon. Not because I screamed or fought dirty. But because I walked away and built something better. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well. It's being happy. It's becoming someone they can't touch anymore. And I had.